I think we'd better read the passage that we're going to look at. Revelation chapter 20. And I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss or the pit, and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him, to keep him from deceiving the nations any more, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be set free for a short time. I saw thrones on which were seated those who had been given authority to judge. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony for Jesus and because of the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who have part in this first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. In number they are like the sand on the seashore. They marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city he loves. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever. We are dealing now with the next part of the last 7 visions in the book of Revelation. 4 and 5. And notice that we're now right into chapter 20. And the most obvious key phrase in the passage I read was 1,000 years. Repeated 6 times in this very short passage. How often does God have to say a thing before we get the message? And not only is it repeated 6 times, 4 times it is 1,000 years, and twice it is the 1,000 years. Very important. Clearly to God, this is a vital period. Now, there are some who take the figure 1,000 years literally. Others take it symbolically. Whichever way you take it, it's a long time. And here we have a long period on the old earth in which certain things happen. The next striking thing about the passage I read is that most of it is about Satan. Quite extraordinary that these 1,000 years, he seems to be the most important person in it. And in fact, I've divided it up, for my understanding, into 3 sections. Verses 1 to 3 talk about Satan being removed. Then, verses 4 to 6, we read about saints reigning. And then, from 7 to 10, Satan is released again. There's a kind of sandwich in this period. It begins with something happening to Satan, and it ends with something happening to Satan. But there's a lot that happens in between, even though it's compressed into just 3 verses of Scripture. But there are many other Scriptures scattered through the Old and the New Testament which clearly relate to this period. Let's take verses 1 to 3. Satan removed from the world. And this seems to be the particular part of Revelation 20 that has caused trouble to our tapes and our machines even here at the beginning of this conference. Notice 5 verbs are applied to him. He is not just bound, and I say that for a reason which will come clear later. He is dealt with by an angel, not by God, not by Jesus. An angel deals with him. As an angel threw him out of heaven, the archangel Michael or Michael, an angel throws him out of the earth. Now, we don't know if that's still Michael or another angel, but it only takes one angel to deal with the devil. It's the final insult. God doesn't bother to deal with him or Jesus. He sends an angel, go and throw that other angel out of earth. For the devil is simply an angel. He was up there in heaven. That's where he originated, a creature of God, a heavenly creature. But he wanted his own kingdom. He rebelled against God and has taught the whole human race to do the same. And we've fallen for his devices. Now, the angel is equipped with a chain, and he first of all binds Satan. Then he throws him into a pit. He locks the pit. He seals the pit. How much more? How many more verbs would we need to be persuaded that the thing is total? Completely shut off from the world that has been his kingdom for centuries. And the Revelation goes on to say he is no longer able to deceive the nations. Incidentally, that word nations always means in the New Testament ethnic groups, and particularly those groups that are not Jewish. It's the same as the word Gentiles, really. The Hebrew word goyim. So he's shut off altogether. That is not the final end of the story. As you noticed, he reappears later. He is released again at the end of 1,000 years. And we shall have to ask why when we come to that part. But at least the earth is going to be free of the devil for 1,000 years. The 2 of his puppets who were controlling the world until now are already in hell. They are already being tormented. They were sent straight from the Battle of Armageddon, thrown alive into hell at that point. But the devil is not sent there yet. Not yet. God has one further purpose for him, which we'll see in a moment. But he's out of the world. The world is free of the devil, of the Antichrist, of the false prophet. And of course that leaves a gigantic political vacuum. Not all the inhabitants of the earth were killed at Armageddon. Only those involved in the army, led by the unholy Trinity. They were slaughtered, but there are still millions of other people living. Who is going to control the situation? Who's going to govern the world now? The answer is Jesus has come back to reign, but he's not going to do it by himself. Way back there in chapter 5, do you remember when we saw Jesus up in heaven? The angel was singing, "Worthy are you, because you have redeemed with your blood from every kindred and tribe and tongue and nation, men for God, and they shall reign on the earth." Furthermore, in one of the 7 letters to the 7 churches, Jesus had said, "He who overcomes will rule the nations with a rod of iron." Exactly the same phrase that is applied to Jesus himself later in the book. So that Jesus and his saints are going to reign. Jesus and the overcomers will constitute the government for the next period of 1,000 years. A Christian government ruling the world. Well, now that's verses 1 to 3. Satan utterly removed, totally helpless, unable to communicate with anyone on earth, shut up in a dungeon. Where that is, don't ask me. But God can have it anywhere. But he prepared the pit for this purpose, as he prepared hell for the devil and all his angels. You know, I often say to people, God never intended human beings to go to hell. He had to prepare it for the devil and all his angels. And incidentally, I forgot to mention that in chapter 12 it says that the devil, when he was thrown out of heaven and came to earth, pulled a third of the heavenly host with him. A third of the stars of heaven followed Satan. A third of the angels rebelled against God. That's a mighty number. We call them demons now, but they're nothing more than angels who shared in Satan's rebellion. But here, Satan is utterly out of the picture. And now the saints reign. Now the next vision needs to be approached very carefully with the simple question, how many groups are mentioned in this middle section? Satan's forgotten now, the saints are reigning now, but how many of them and who are they? And a superficial quick reading could be quite misleading. We notice the word thrones now. There it is again. We've so far only seen thrones in heaven. Now we're seeing thrones on earth. A throne is a ruler's seat. And he first of all sees a number of people who have been given the responsibility of ruling the earth under Christ. And he sees them on thrones, ruling. To them has been given judgment, the establishment of justice in the world. While there is sinners and sin in the world, there will always be need for judgment and for justice to be done. But it will be perfectly done in the millennium through Christ and his servants. Now, I take this first group that is mentioned to be all the overcomers, all those who have taken part in what is called the first resurrection. And it's overcomers who later inherit the new heaven and the earth. I'm afraid believers who under pressure have denied Jesus will not be part of this. So let's move on. Within that larger group, he says again, and I saw. What has he seen now? He sees a smaller group. And he sees a group of martyrs now, those who have been beheaded, those who have been executed for the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Is this a second group? Well, if the first group are overcoming saints, then this is a second group, though they were faithful unto death. And then we find apparently another group, a third group. He sees those who were resistant to the beast, the Antichrist, who refused to take the number on their hand and on their forehead. And now he sees them. Again, apparently the martyrs, who for their refusal were killed. And some people have thought there are three groups here. I don't think so. A very careful reading of the Greek suggests that there is one large group and within it a smaller group. The smaller group being part of the larger. In other words, he sees the overcoming saints first, ruling over the earth. But within that group, he particularly notices those who were killed and thrown out of the earth during that last dreadful struggle. And it's such a comfort to them and to him to know that they are now in charge. Human courts and judges executed them and expelled them from the world, but now they are on the judgment seats. It's an extraordinary reversal of people. And I think it's written here to strengthen the people who were facing death. I told you this book is a manual for martyrdom. And many a Christian who has died for the Lord is on record as saying and as thinking, when a Roman emperor condemned them to be thrown to the lions, they comforted themselves by saying, one day I will be in your place and you'll be in mine. It's a great reversal. These people were told they were not fit to be allowed to live on the earth. Now They are in the judgment seat. Extraordinary reversal of fortune. But these are not exclusive groups. Undoubtedly, there were other martyrs alongside them. But John, you see, is preparing people for the last big trouble here. And he's saying, even if they kill you and martyr you, one day you'll be on their throne. Hold on to that. And for the joy set before you, endure the shame. Now, it is my privilege to minister to many different kinds of people. I love to go to gypsy camps. I have a lot to do with gypsies in England. There are 60,000 of them. And there is now not a gypsy family in England without a Christian in it. And the most remarkable move of God in my country is among gypsies. The outcasts, the people nobody wants to talk to. The lovely people, though. And what a transformation Christ is bringing into their lives. I love being with them. The other group I love ministering to, and I have the opportunity, is in a top security prison where all of the men I talk to are there for life. They are drug dealers, they are murderers, they're killers, one way or another, and they've all been sent to prison for life. I learned quickly that you never ask how much longer have you to do, because they just shut their minds to the freedom that they have lost. But a remarkable thing is happening in that prison. An entire wing has been converted. Every prisoner in one whole block is now a Christian. And with the governor's permission, they have knocked down the walls of the cells. They now live in brotherhood as one community. And they've changed the locks from the outside of the doors to the inside. And that whole wing, that whole block, which used to be the worst in the prison, where the officers only went in threes for their own protection, and where human excrement was smeared on the walls, dreadful place. Now the officers go and knock on the door of the cell. May we come in? And the prisoners say, come in, sit down, we'll make you coffee and we'll read the Bible to you. It is a remarkable... The governor cannot believe what's happened. And you can see their faces change. Now, I talk to them for 3 to 4 hours at a time. Once nearly got shut in at night when the gates closed. But you know, last time I told them, if you are now faithful to Jesus and you overcome the pressures that you've been under, one day some of you will be judges sitting in courts, applying justice to others. And I said, you'll have a chance then to be fair, even if you feel a sense of injustice now. Well, their eyes were out on stalks. The idea, their mouths were this wide. The idea that prisoners, life prisoners, could ever be sitting on a judge's bench. Boy. But I said, why not? Why not? God's in the business of recycling people. And we're going to get a lot of surprises when he comes. The first shall be last and the last first, again and again and again. Well, here we have those who are judged unworthy of living, thrown out of the earth by worldly judges, and now they are sitting on the thrones. Jesus made the same sort of promise to some fishermen. He said, you will judge the 12 tribes of Israel. They could hardly believe it. You know, Paul, writing to the Corinthians, had heard that they were arguing, that actually Christians were going to worldly courts to sue each other. That's a scandal. I'm afraid it's happening today too. Christians going before a judge who doesn't believe in God and suing a fellow Christian in law. Jesus told us, before you bring your offering, you go and be reconciled to your brother. But it's happening, and it was happening in Corinth. And do you know what Paul said to them to sort it out? He said, you must sort out this difference among yourselves and settle the dispute. You're going to judge the nations. You're going to settle disputes for the world. And you can't even settle them for yourself. You have to go to an outside judge. It's a very interesting little argument there in 1 Corinthians 6. You look it up. We are to be in training now, not just for the tribulation, as Corrie ten Boom said. We are in training for the millennium. We are in training to take the world over under Christ. But I'll say more about that later. We're told very little in Revelation 20 here, but it's clear that people who've died for Christ are now on the judgment seat, applying justice to others. All the overcoming saints, and particularly the martyrs, John sees them in this vision. We're going to go straight on and come back to that later. I'll go straight on with the passage because we want to deal with the controversial issues. I think the big surprise, no, let's just draw this out. If there are dead martyrs here judging, then obviously they've been raised from the dead. And if all the saints are there, many of them have been raised from the dead too. And so John makes this quite clear. There has been a resurrection limited to those saints who come back to reign. It is the first resurrection, he says. Blessed and holy are those who have a part in that first resurrection. In other words, there are to be two resurrections. Now, this is clearly stated here, the first and the second, one at the beginning of the millennium and the other at the end. One of the righteous, the other of the wicked. Now, that is a truth that many Christians seem to have missed. And in fact, the majority of churches in my country believe in one general resurrection, as they call it, of everybody to be judged. But here it is clearly stated, there is a first resurrection and a second. And in fact, you find both Jesus himself in the Gospels and Paul in his letters confirming this simple truth. Not everybody will be raised at once. It is very clear, of course, that everybody will be resurrected. That means everybody will get a body and live again. Daniel was the first to say this. Daniel 12 says that both the righteous and the unrighteous will be raised from the dust. Some to everlasting life and others to everlasting shame, but both will be raised. Jesus himself said exactly the same, that both the righteous and the wicked will be raised. Paul, on trial for his life, said, I am on trial because I believe in the resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. Everybody's going to be in a resurrection. Everybody will get a new body. The righteous and the wicked, the good and the bad. That is why people have not escaped the judgment of God. Adolf Hitler will be resurrected by God and faced with what he did. There is no escape from God. There will be the resurrection of the righteous and wicked, but what is being said here is that the resurrection of the righteous is long before the resurrection of the others. The rest of humankind will not be raised until after the reign of Christ on earth is over. Now let's take that a little further. There are two resurrections here, one of the saints and one of the rest. Now Jesus himself was once asked about this, and he was asked, did he believe in the resurrection of the righteous? And he said he did, and talked about it. And Paul refers to this first resurrection again and again. And he gives it a very unusual label. He calls it the resurrection, the out-resurrection, out from the dead, when he refers to it. Uses the word out twice. In Greek, it's a little two-letter word ek. And he uses this twice every time he mentions it. The out-resurrection, out from among the dead. And he describes Jesus' resurrection as a resurrection out from the dead. And what that phrase means is not a general resurrection, but somebody being taken out of the world of the dead and resurrected. You follow me? leaving other dead behind. And Jesus certainly had an resurrection out from the dead, because he left everybody else behind. He was unique. He was the firstborn of all creation. He was the first fruits of new life. And Paul's ambition was to share in that first resurrection and not be left until the second. That is why he says in the letter to the Philippians that he wanted to share the sufferings of Christ, that he might share the glory that followed, that he might attain to the resurrection out from among the dead. There's the phrase again. He wants to be raised as an overcoming saint. And even Paul himself did not presume that he would be among them. He says, leaving everything behind and pressing on to that which is before, I press on toward the goal for the prize, the high calling. Paul didn't take it for granted that once saved, always saved. He said, I'm pressing on. I want to be in that first resurrection. I want to attain that. And so I'm wanting to be as like Christ as possible. I want to share his sufferings. It's interesting that he saw suffering the way through to that first resurrection. Do you? Well, that should be the ambition of every Christian, to be among those who rise and reign with Christ on this old earth for 1,000 years. I certainly want to. Well, that's enough. Let's move on to the release of Satan. Now, if God hadn't revealed this in his word, I would never have guessed it, would you? It is so unexpected, so extraordinary. There are the Antichrist and the false prophets still in torment in hell, but Satan is allowed back again into this world. Why on earth would God want to do that? Because immediately he begins to damage the situation. Immediately he gathers an army, a huge army, numbering like the sand of the sea, and they march to Jerusalem, the city he loves, God's camp, the camp of God's people. They are determined to destroy this Christian government, which of course will be centered on Jerusalem, the headquarters of the real United Nations. And they don't even get anywhere near. Fire comes from heaven and destroys them on the way. But why on earth should God allow this to happen? Well, there's nothing specifically said here, but it makes a lot of sense to me. I will confess I'm now inferring from Scripture, so you can take it or leave it, but it seems to me exactly what God would decide to do. He has given the world 1,000 years of peace, prosperity, health, longer living. He's given them all they say they want, except the freedom to go on in sin, vice, and crime. And they don't like it. You see, what God is proving at the last is this, that sin is not a product of your environment. It's a product of your heart. There are humanists today who say that all the sin, vice, and crime is due to economic conditions, due to poverty, due to bad housing, due to a whole host of things, and that if we put the environment right and gave people a decent house to live in and a working wage and all the rest of it, so many politicians, humanists, who believe that basically human nature is good and that it's external influences on us that makes us rebellious. It's a lie. It's a fraud. Don't believe it. And so they promise to improve the environment and everything's going to be wonderful. And Russia got the revolution and believed that they would be in a crimeless, classless society from then on, and very quickly found out nothing of the sort follows. Because sin is in the heart. It's rebellion against external influence. It's wanting to do your own thing. And even though that millennium will be a wonderful time, a wonderful environment in which to live, in which people ought to be happy and healthy, there will be an underlying resentment against not being free to do the bad things that we really want to do. And so God has to show finally, to demonstrate to the world, It's not the world that makes us sin. It's not our environment that forces us to be unkind to each other. It's not that at all. It's the heart that is still sinful even in an ideal environment. And Satan comes with the same suggestion that he came to Adam and Eve with. It's as if history ends as it began. Satan comes and says, you don't want to obey the Lord. You don't want to do what this government tells you. You don't want to live under the kingdom of God, do you? Then come on, let's make a break for freedom. And he is able to gather thousands and thousands of people who want to get rid of the Christian government. Now God has demonstrated so clearly that the real issue is quite simple. The issue is, do people want to live in his kingdom or not? Do they want to live under his rule or not? Do they want to enjoy the benefits that come from his rule? Or would they still rather do without those benefits and do what they want to do? That's the choice. And that answer to that choice will divide families and communities, towns and cities right down the middle. In other words, it is all a preparation for Judgment Day, to justify the action of God in dividing the human race into two groups forever. Does that make sense to you? Satan is allowed to be free to demonstrate that still underneath there is rebellion in the human heart against living God's way, and a determination to be free to live their own way, which is what has ruined this world all the way through. Now that then is the passage which is called the millennial passage. I've given you just the rough outlines of it. Now come two crucial questions about what is said. It's said simply and clearly what has happened during that 1,000 years. The questions are, where is all this happening? And the second question is, when is it all happening? To the question where, the answer is surely here on the old earth. Now, I know that Revelation as a book goes up and down from heaven to earth, and it's almost like a roller coaster ride at times. And so you've got to ask of each section, where is this? Are we up in heaven now, or are we down on earth? But when I look at this passage, it is very clear from the whole context that this series of visions is on earth. The rider on the white horse is coming from heaven down to earth. And you notice at the beginning of chapter 20, I saw an angel coming down out of heaven. Well, Satan is already on earth. He's been thrown out of heaven. The angel has to come down from heaven to deal with him and lock him up. And you find that when Satan is released after the 1,000 years, he goes out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth. There's no mention of being up in heaven here until the fire comes down from heaven and deals with this last satanic army, which incidentally is called Gog and Magog, a reference back to Ezekiel if you care to look it up. In other words, Armageddon is not the last battle. In fact, it's not even a battle. There's no fighting takes place, but it's often called the last battle, but it's the second last. The last is Gog and Magog. And again, there's no battle. Fire from heaven deals with the situation. No fighting goes on. But it's all over so quickly. In other words, every reference to location through these chapters, through these visions, is earth. It's what's happening on earth. Therefore, this reign of Christ and the saints for 1,000 years is on earth. Though it's amazing how many commentators try and persuade us that it's the saints reigning up in heaven, because they don't like the implication of a reign on earth. But the other question is the critical one, over which there is great division of opinion among Christians. Deep division, so much so that in my country there is now a gentleman's agreement to a conspiracy of silence. And if ever I talk on the millennium, I am heavily criticized for being divisive, for not being interested in Christian unity and not being loving. Oh dear, the accusations. That's true of my country. I don't think it's